Hello and welcome to Stories in Life. Here we share real and emotional stories that touch the heart, make you think, and sometimes even change the way you see the world. If you love deep, meaningful life experiences, subscribe now and join our community. Your support helps us bring you even more powerful stories that inspire, move, and stay with you long after the video ends. So, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story together. The gray Chicago sky pressed down on her shoulders. Elena Williams stood on the courthouse steps, feeling the bitter November wind creep under the collar of her old coat. The divorce decree she held in her hand seemed weightless, but somehow it made her fingers feel heavy, as if it were cast from lead. "Mom, are we going to stand here much longer?" Julia tugged at her sleeve. The girl was wrapped in a bright scarf, the last gift from her father before he announced he was leaving. Elena blinked, as if surfacing from deep water. "No, sweetheart, we're going home now." "Home?" Julia asked hopefully. The word home echoed in her chest with a dull ache. There was no home anymore. The two-bedroom apartment in Riverside, where they had lived as a family of 3 just a month ago, now belonged to the bank. The mortgage had been in Elena's name, but paying it alone had proven impossible. Not exactly. Elena knelt in front of her daughter, tucking a strand of light hair behind her ear. "Do you remember me telling you about Grandma Rose? My grandmother. The one who lives in the little house with the apple orchard." The girl's face brightened slightly. "Yes, that's right. We're going to stay with her. For a while," Elena added, not knowing who she was trying to convince, her daughter or herself. They walked down the steps and headed toward the bus stop. Elena didn't want to remember what had happened in the courtroom, but the memories were too fresh, scratching at her consciousness, making it hard to focus on simple movements. Take a step, adjust her bag, check for the bus ticket. "I'm not refusing to pay child support." Robert's voice had sounded irritated. "But I don't want the child. Not on weekends, not during holidays. Do you understand what you're saying?" The judge, a woman over 50 with tired eyes, had looked at him over her glasses. "You're refusing parental rights to your own child." "Rights? Obligations. No." Robert had straightened his shoulders. "I have a new family, and my wife is pregnant. We're starting with a clean slate, and having a child from a previous marriage would be inappropriate." Elena had sat gripping the edge of the bench, unable to find the strength to look up. Inappropriate. That's what he had called their 9-year-old daughter. As if she were an old sofa that didn't fit with the new decor. Sitting in the half-empty bus, Elena wondered what she had done wrong all these years. Maybe she had worked too much, neglected herself, turned into a workhorse. She and Robert had met in college, and it had seemed like a fairy tale. A young professor had noticed a shy student. Then came the wedding, Julia's birth, house hunting, the mortgage. And then Robert started staying late at work, saying his graduate assistant needed extra consultation. Elena had believed him. "Mom, does Dad know where we're going?" Julia's question pulled her from her memories. "No, honey. Will he look for us?" Hope flickered in her daughter's voice. Elena felt her heart squeeze. How could she explain to a child that her father had just legally abandoned her? "I don't think so." She tried to speak evenly. "Dad is very busy with work, and he's going to have another baby now. So he doesn't need me anymore." Tears stood in Julia's gray eyes. "Did he stop loving me?" "No, of course not." Elena pulled her daughter close. "Sometimes adults make mistakes and wrong decisions. Could you make that decision too?" Julia suddenly pulled back and looked at her mother fearfully. "Could you find a new husband and decide I'm inappropriate?" The question sent heat rushing through Elena. She gripped her daughter's shoulders firmly. "Never, do you hear me? Never. You and I are one. Even if the whole world turns upside down, I'll always be with you." Julia watched her carefully, as if weighing the sincerity of these words. Then she nodded and nestled against her mother, trustingly resting her head on her shoulder. At home, in the rental apartment they would have to vacate in 3 days, packed suitcases and several boxes of essentials awaited them. Everything else had to be sold for almost nothing or given away. Elena sent her daughter to bed early and sat by the window with a cup of tea. She didn't turn on the light. It was easier to think while looking at the lights of nighttime Chicago. Grandma Rose lived in Millbrook in an old house she had inherited from her parents. That's where they would go tomorrow. Elena hadn't been there since her teenage years, but she remembered the smell of the apple orchard and the creak of floorboards in the sunny sitting room. How did I come to this? She thought, pressing the hot cup against her cheek. Starting over at 29 without a husband, without housing, without money, with a child to care for. She imagined looking for work in Millbrook. What could she do? Teach foreign languages to children, do bookkeeping. In a small town, that probably wouldn't be much use. She'd have to retrain, start small. A neighbor's cat jumped onto the windowsill, a smoky gray Tom with yellow eyes. He sometimes visited them through the slightly open window, and Julia would feed him. Now he looked at Elena as if asking what would happen next. I don't know either, she whispered, scratching the cat behind the ear. But we have no choice. We have to go to Grandma's. Strangely, as soon as she spoke these words aloud, her heart felt lighter, as if the decision that had seemed forced suddenly felt right. Maybe there, away from the city bustle, from memories, from ghosts of her past life, she would manage to find herself and start everything anew. Elena smiled at her thoughts. After all, she was only 29. She had her whole life ahead of her. And most importantly, she had Julia, a girl worth fighting for, even when her hands wanted to give up. That night, Elena fell asleep without tears or sleeping pills for the first time in a long while. In the morning, while packing the last things, she found a forgotten photo album in the closet. Flipping through the faded pages, she stopped at a picture of her mother, a young woman in a simple cotton dress with little Elena in her arms. Behind them, factory smoke was visible, a symbol of an era that had seemed so reliable but turned out to be so fragile. Her mother had survived the economic collapse, unemployment, and breadlines, but she hadn't broken. She had raised her daughter, given her an education, taught her not to give up. Nearby lay a well-worn cookbook with yellowed pages covered in Grandma's handwriting. Recipes for cabbage pies, carrot cutlets, dried fruit compote. A real culinary history of the family, passed down from generation to generation. Elena carefully wrapped the book in a towel and put it in her bag, a small piece of home she would take with her into her new life. In one of the photographs, yellowed with frayed edges, young Rose stood at the gate of her house, holding little Elena. Under the photo, in faded ink, was written, "A second chance always comes from where you least expect it." Elena carefully placed the photograph in her purse. Maybe Grandma was right. Maybe this was her second chance. The train moved in jerks, as if reluctantly moving away from the capital. Outside the window, depressing November suburban landscapes flowed by. Bare trees, gray houses, pigeons pecking in puddles. Elena sat with her forehead pressed against the cold glass, while Julia dozed with her head on her mother's lap. The monotonous sound of wheels was soothing. The girl sniffled, sometimes wrinkling her nose in her sleep, as she always did when she was dreaming. Elena carefully brushed away the hair that fell on her daughter's face, trying not to wake her. The car was almost empty. A couple of students with backpacks, an elderly woman with a cart stuffed with bundles, a middle-aged man buried in a book. So my whole life now fits in these 2 suitcases and a backpack, Elena thought, looking at their modest luggage. Strange thing. She felt not only the bitterness of loss, but also some amazing, almost shameful relief, as if she had dropped a heavy stone she had been carrying for years. For 9 years she had lived the illusion of a happy marriage. She had cooked, washed, worked, raised her daughter, tried to please her husband, afraid to admit even to herself that everything had long been falling apart. And now freedom. Scary, unknown, but still freedom. Next station, Millbrook, the speaker crackled. Train stops for 2 minutes. Elena carefully woke her daughter. Julia, wake up, we need to get off. The girl blinked sleepily, rubbing her eyes with her fists. Are we at Grandma's already? We still have a little walk to Grandma's. Come on, sweetheart, let's get ready. They got off at a small platform, swept by a bitter wind. Julia shivered, wrapping herself in her jacket. Elena tried to hold 2 suitcases while keeping track of her daughter. "Do you remember where Grandma lives?" Julia asked, looking around. "Of course," Elena smiled. "I spent every summer here until I went to college." But when they left the station area, Elena's confidence wavered slightly. The village had changed. New houses had appeared. Old fences leaned more than before. Some streets seemed to have been renamed. "That way." She pointed right, where rooftops could be seen between the trees. "About 20 minutes on foot." They were about to set off when Elena felt someone tugging at her bag. Turning around, she saw a small boy about 6 years old. Thin, with large brown eyes and dark curls escaping from his tied hat. He was dressed too lightly for the season, a jacket obviously too big for him, pants without lining. "Lady, don't leave," he whispered, not letting go of the bag. His voice was shaking. Lena froze. A chill ran down her spine. "Are you lost?" She knelt in front of the boy, looking into his eyes. "Where are your parents?" "I don't know." The boy sniffled. "I was traveling with my nanny. She said we were going to my aunt's and that I should stay there. Then she said she was going to the bathroom and didn't come back. I waited and waited, then got off here. I thought maybe she was here." Something in his eyes, hunted, desperate, struck Elena to the core. She had felt the same way just yesterday, standing on the courthouse steps. Abandoned, unwanted, betrayed. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Paul," the boy answered. "Paul Anderson." "And how old are you, Paul?" "6. Almost 7," he added proudly, straightening up. "And what are your names?" "I'm Elena, and this is my daughter Julia." Julia, who had been watching the conversation from the side, nodded reluctantly. Distrust was clear in her gaze. "Mom, we need to go," she tugged at Elena's sleeve. "Grandma is waiting." "Wait, honey," Elena thought. "We can't leave a child alone at the station. Why can't he just go home?" Irritation sounded in Julia's voice. "Because I don't know where my home is," Paul answered seriously. "The nanny said Dad went far away, and I should live with this aunt. But I don't know this aunt." He paused and added quietly, "I don't know anyone here." Elena felt a lump rising in her throat. She looked at her watch. 5 o'clock in the evening. It would be dark soon. There was no one left at the station except them. "We need to call the police," she murmured. "No!" the boy exclaimed, clutching her jacket. "No police. They'll put me in foster care." "Why do you think that?" Elena was surprised. "The nanny said if I misbehaved, they'd put me in foster care where they beat you and don't feed you," Paul whispered. "I don't want to go there." Elena sighed. What should she do? She couldn't just take someone else's child, but she couldn't leave him here alone at an empty station either. "Come with us," she said decisively, standing up. "My grandmother is a wise woman. She'll know what to do." "Mom," Julia protested. "We don't know him at all. Do we have a choice?" Elena quietly asked her daughter, drawing her aside. "Imagine if you were left alone at a strange station. Wouldn't you want someone to help you?" Julia sulked but said nothing. Elena turned to Paul again. "Will you come with us? It's not far to Grandma's house." The boy nodded and unexpectedly smiled. The smile transformed his face. From hunted and tired, it became childishly open. "Thank you," he said, carefully taking Elena's hand. They walked along the snowy road between wooden fences. Paul held Elena's hand tightly, while Julia walked slightly ahead, demonstratively not looking back. "Grandma lives in that house with the carved window frames." Elena pointed to a blue house at the end of the street. "See, there are apple trees in the yard." Paul nodded, looking at the house with curiosity. Julia, noticing the familiar place, perked up a little and ran ahead. "Grandma!" she called, running to the gate. "It's us." The door of the house opened, and a thin, elderly woman in a knitted cardigan and headscarf came out onto the porch. Despite her age, she held herself straight, and there was grace in her movements. "My dear ones have arrived," Rose smiled, hugging Julia, who had run up to her. "I was waiting. I put the kettle on, baked some pies." Then she noticed Paul, who was hiding behind Elena's back. "And who do we have here?" Elena hesitated, not knowing how to explain the situation. But Grandma Rose was already kneeling in front of the boy. "Hello, young man," she said, looking directly into his eyes. "What's your name?" "Paul Anderson," the boy answered quietly, but didn't look away. "A good name," Rose nodded. "A saint's name. Saint Paul traveled a lot, and you, I see, are also a traveler." "Grandma, we found him at the station," Elena intervened. "His nanny abandoned him. We couldn't leave him there." Rose looked carefully at her granddaughter, then at Paul again, and straightened up easily. "Of course you couldn't," she said calmly. "And you did the right thing. You never know what roads bring a person to your house and why." She sighed, looking somewhere into the distance, and added more quietly. "In 1943, when the Germans were retreating, I found such a girl on the edge of the forest. Trembling, hungry. She lived with us for 3 days until her father found her. A month later they brought us a bag of potatoes. Then it was worth more than gold. So you never know where you'll lose, where you'll find. Come on, all of you, into the warmth. The story can wait, but hot tea cannot." The house smelled of apples, cinnamon, and dried herbs. The stove was heated, and a plate of pies stood on the table. Paul looked around with undisguised interest. "It's beautiful here," he said. "And warm." "Thank you, dear," Rose smiled. "The house has stood for almost 100 years. My grandfather built it. It has seen more than this. War and devastation, joy and sorrow. But it stands like all of us." She looked at Elena, who had tiredly sunk onto the bench by the window. "Julia, show Paul where he can wash his hands," Rose said. "And I'll have a word with your mother." Julia nodded reluctantly and led the boy to the hallway. "I don't know what to do, Grandma," Elena whispered when the children left. "We should report to the police, but he's so afraid. And what kind of nanny abandons a child?" Rose sat next to her granddaughter and took her hand. "Don't worry ahead of time," she said. "You're not the first, not the last to bring an unexpected guest into the house. Tomorrow we'll figure out what's what. Tonight let the children rest, eat, sleep. Morning is wiser than evening." "But what if they're looking for him? What if we're breaking the law?" "Don't you think," Rose said quietly, "that if they were really looking for him, they wouldn't send him with some nanny to an unknown aunt?" Elena thought about it. There was sense in Grandma's words. "I've seen that look, granddaughter," Elena whispered. "Like an abandoned puppy. I was looking at myself in the mirror the same way recently." Rose nodded and placed her wrinkled palm on her granddaughter's cheek. "I know, that's why I'm not asking what happened. I can see everything in your eyes. But remember, sometimes we find not what we were looking for, but what we really need." The children returned to the room. Julia still kept her distance, but Paul seemed to have settled in a bit. He admired the old photographs on the walls. "Whose portrait is this?" he asked, pointing to a photograph of a young soldier. "That's my husband Stephen," Rose answered. "Your great-grandfather," she added, addressing Julia. "He's been gone a long time, but his spirit lives in this house." "Was he a soldier?" Paul was interested. "An artilleryman. We met at the front," Rose smiled. "But that's a long story. Better sit down at the table, the tea is getting cold." When they sat down for dinner, Elena noticed how hungrily Paul ate, although he tried to do it neatly. When his plate was empty, the boy looked at Rose and said seriously, "Thank you, I haven't had home-cooked food in a long time." Something in his voice made Elena shudder. She felt warmth spreading in her chest. Not pity, but something else, deeper and more important. Meeting Grandma's eyes, she understood that Rose felt the same. Then she caught Julia's glance, wary, jealous. Her daughter looked at Paul as if he were a potential threat. Elena mentally sighed. Not only the boy, but her own daughter needed support and love now too. After all, she had also experienced betrayal. Her father had rejected her as if she were an unwanted thing. How complicated everything is, Elena thought, looking at the two children at the table. One abandoned by unknown people for unknown reasons, the other betrayed by her own father. And she herself was a woman with a broken heart and empty pockets. What a strange company had gathered in this old house on the edge of Millbrook. But somewhere deep inside, hope flickered that maybe all this wasn't accidental. Maybe they had found each other precisely when they needed it most. Morning in Rose's house began with roosters. Their hoarse voices cut through the dawn silence, announcing to the world that night was over, whether you wanted it or not. Elena woke up and spent several minutes looking at the ceiling at the cracks familiar from childhood, which always reminded her of a map of unexplored lands. Once she had made up stories about these imaginary countries, populating them with fantastic creatures. Now it seemed that life itself was writing a story more bizarre than any fantasy. Julia slept next to her, and on the folding bed that Grandma had set up in their room last night, Paul was sleeping soundly. In sleep, his features softened, the wary expression disappeared, and he seemed quite small, younger than his 6 years. Elena carefully got up, trying not to wake the children, and went to the kitchen. Grandma Rose was already bustling around the stove, lighting the fire. "Good morning," Elena said quietly, approaching her. "Good morning to you too, dear," Rose responded without turning around. "Did you sleep well?" "Strangely enough, yes. For the first time in many days." "The air here is different," Grandma nodded. "City dust doesn't clog your lungs. And probably your soul feels lighter too. You dropped the burden." Elena sat on a stool, watching how skillfully Rose managed the firewood. "Grandma, we need to find this boy's father," she said after a pause. "He's probably looking for his son." "Or he's not looking," Rose shrugged. "The boy was abandoned by a nanny. Who does that to a child? Maybe she kidnapped him and then got scared." "Maybe so," Grandma agreed, closing the stove door. "But something tells me not everything is simple here. We need to talk to the boy when he wakes up." The opportunity presented itself after breakfast. Paul, satisfied with Grandma's pancakes with jam, became more talkative. "Do you have a garden?" he asked, looking out the window at the bare apple trees. "Yes," Rose smiled. "In spring it blooms so you can't take your eyes off it, and in fall there are so many apples that the whole village has enough." "Dad also had a garden," Paul said thoughtfully. "At the country house, but we rarely went there." Elena exchanged glances with Grandma. "Paul," she began carefully, "where does your dad live?" "In Chicago," the boy answered. "He has a big apartment and also a restaurant. They cook very delicious food there." "And your mom?" Rose asked, putting more pancakes on his plate. The boy's face immediately closed up. "I don't have a mom," he said quietly. "She left when I was little. Victoria said she abandoned us." "Victoria is your nanny," Elena clarified. Paul nodded. "She said Dad went on a business trip and I should stay with some aunt. We got on the train, but Victoria kept looking at her phone. Then she said she needed to go to the bathroom and didn't come back. I waited. Then the train stopped and everyone started getting off." He paused, fingering the edge of the tablecloth. "I got off and started looking for her, then I saw you." There was so much unchildlike tiredness in his voice that Elena's heart ached. This child had already had to survive his mother's betrayal, and now the nanny had abandoned him too. "Do you know your dad's full name?" she asked. "Of course," Paul was surprised. "Dennis Anderson. He has business cards. He always carries them in his suit jacket pocket." "Do you remember his phone number?" Paul shook his head. "Victoria didn't let me call Dad. She said he was busy and shouldn't be disturbed. The phone number was written in my backpack, but..." He looked around in confusion. "I don't have my backpack. It stayed on the train." Julia, who had been silent all this time, suddenly spoke up. "What was in the backpack?" My pajamas, Paul answered. And a book and my bear. He said the last word so quietly it could barely be heard. You had a teddy bear. Julia moved closer. Paul nodded. Dad gave it to me. I always sleep with it. Julia silently got up, left the kitchen, and returned in a minute holding a worn plush rabbit. Here, she said, offering the toy to Paul. This is Buddy. You can sleep with him until we find your bear. Elena looked at her daughter in surprise. Buddy had been Julia's favorite toy since she was 3. She had never parted with him and never let anyone else touch him. Paul carefully took the rabbit, as if afraid the offer would be withdrawn. Thank you, he said seriously. I'll take care of him. Something changed in the kitchen atmosphere after this simple gesture. As if the ice that had bound the children's relationship began to melt. After lunch, Elena decided to act. She couldn't keep the child without telling his father. But how to find him? There was no phone or internet in the house. Go to Barbara White, Rose advised. She works as a librarian at the school. She has a computer with internet. The children stayed with Grandma, and Elena set off on her search. Barbara White, an elderly but energetic woman with bright lipstick on thin lips, greeted her warmly. Elena, how many years, how many winters? You've grown up completely and got married, they say. I got married, Elena nodded. And divorced. Barbara nodded understandingly. Life is like that. Sometimes it lifts you up, sometimes it strikes you down. How can I help? Elena briefly told the story of Paul, omitting the details of her own life situation. I need to find his father on the internet. Maybe there's information there. Of course, dear. Barbara turned on the computer. What's the last name? Anderson. Dennis Anderson. He supposedly has a restaurant in Chicago. They spent about an hour browsing search results. It turned out that Dennis Anderson was the owner of a chain of restaurants called Home Hearth, a fairly successful business with 4 locations in different areas of Chicago. The company website listed a phone number for contact. Well, there you go, we found him, Barbara smiled. Call him. Elena hesitated, looking at the number. Suddenly she felt scared. What would she say to this unknown person? Hello, I have your son. Wouldn't that sound like in crime movies about kidnapping? And what if he decided she had deliberately sought out a rich man? After all, a single mother with a child, having just gone through a divorce, finds the son of a wealthy businessman. Sounded like a cheap novel. Something wrong? Barbara asked, noticing her confusion. Just thinking about how to best explain the situation, Elena answered. All this is so strange. Truth is always better than any fiction, the librarian shrugged. Tell it like it is. If he's a normal person, he'll understand. Elena took a deep breath and dialed the number. After several rings, a female voice answered on the other end. Home Hearth Restaurant. How can I help you? Hello. Elena tried to speak calmly. I need to speak with Dennis Anderson about a personal matter. Mr. Anderson can't come to the phone right now. What should I tell him? Elena hesitated. It concerns his son Paul. It's very important. There was a pause on the other end of the line. One moment, the woman finally said. I'll connect you. A few seconds later, a low male voice sounded in the receiver. Hello. Dennis Anderson speaking. Hello. Elena involuntarily straightened her shoulders, as if the caller could see her. My name is Elena Williams. You don't know me, but I have your son Paul. The silence on the line was so long that Elena thought the connection had been lost. What do you mean, have? The man finally asked. And in his voice was such a mixture of hope and fear that Elena's doubts instantly disappeared. This person was really worried about his son. We met yesterday at Millbrook Station. He was alone. He said his nanny left him on the train. I couldn't abandon the child, so I took him with me to my grandmother's. He's fine, don't worry. Another pause, then a muffled exhale. Thank God. I've been going crazy for 24 hours. Victoria said he disappeared from the house. I had the whole police force searching. So Victoria didn't lose him. Elena was surprised. Paul said she took him to some aunt and left him on the train. What? There was such genuine amazement in the man's voice that Elena understood he really didn't know. I didn't send him anywhere. Victoria was supposed to watch him at home while I was at work. He paused, clearly trying to cope with emotions. Listen, Elena, where are you now? I'll come for my son immediately. Elena gave him Grandma's house address. I'll be there in 2 hours, Dennis said. Thank you so much. I don't know how to express my gratitude. When the conversation ended, Elena sat for a long time, looking at the phone. Inside her, contradictory feelings struggled. On one hand, she was glad that Paul's father turned out not to be some monster who had abandoned his child, but a person sincerely worried about his son. On the other hand, a strange feeling of loss overwhelmed her at the thought that in 2 hours the boy would leave their lives forever. Everything all right? Barbara asked. Yes, Elena nodded. The father will come for him. He was looking for his son, reported to the police. Victoria lied to him, said Paul disappeared from home. Well, that's good, the librarian smiled. Good always returns, Elena. You did the right thing. Walking home, Elena thought about how to tell Paul that his dad would come soon. The boy would be happy, of course, but how would Julia react? She had just started getting used to her new companion. And now he was leaving. Approaching the house, she heard children's laughter in the yard. Julia and Paul were running around the old apple tree, playing some game. Her daughter's face was flushed from running and joy. Paul seemed to have forgotten his troubles and looked like an ordinary carefree 6-year-old. Grandma Rose sat on a bench by the fence, watching the children with a peaceful smile. Noticing her granddaughter, she patted the spot next to her. Did you find the father? She asked when Elena sat down. Yes, he'll be here in 2 hours. He seems like a good man. Elena watched Julia help Paul climb onto the lower branch of the apple tree. He was looking for his son, reported to the police. The nanny lied to him, said Paul disappeared from the house. Strange affairs, Rose shook her head. Looks like this Victoria intended to get rid of the boy. Maybe wanted to become a mistress and the child was in the way, or just got scared of the responsibility, Elena suggested. Who knows what was in her head? They sat in silence, watching the playing children. Julia was telling Paul something, gesticulating animatedly, and he listened with his mouth open, clearly fascinated. The girl got attached to him, Rose noted. And he to her too. I know, Elena sighed. But what can you do? He has a father who loves him and was looking for him. Fate doesn't always go straight roads, Grandma answered mysteriously. Sometimes it loops like a hair from a wolf, but it still leads to the right place. Elena wanted to ask what she meant, but at that moment Julia noticed her and ran toward them, dragging Paul behind her. Mom, we found a real hedgehog in the garden. He snorted and curled up in a ball, and he didn't prick, Paul added, breathless from running. I petted him. Carefully, with one finger. Looking at their flushed, happy faces, Elena didn't have the heart to immediately share the news. Let them stay a little longer in this serene children's world where the main event of the day was meeting a hedgehog. Then she heard the sound of an approaching car. Turning around, Elena saw a black SUV stop at the gate. A tall man in a dark coat got out. Despite his fashionable haircut and expensive clothes, he looked exhausted. Dark circles showed under his eyes, and gray was clearly visible in his dark hair. He opened the gate and froze, seeing the children. Then a single word escaped his lips. Paul. The boy turned at the voice and froze. Then his face lit up with such pure, such genuine joy that Elena caught her breath. Dad! He cried and rushed across the yard. Dennis Anderson dropped to one knee, opening his arms, and Paul flew into them at full speed. The father hugged his son tightly, burying his face in his dark curls. And Elena noticed with surprise that the man's shoulders were shaking. He was crying. A strong, confident businessman was crying, hugging his child, not ashamed of strangers' eyes. Julia approached her mother and took her hand. "Is Paul leaving?" she asked quietly. "Yes, sweetheart," Elena answered, squeezing the small fingers. "He has a dad who loves him very much. And we." There was such longing in her daughter's voice that Elena was at a loss. "What about us? We'll disappear from his life too. Like Dad did." Elena knelt in front of her daughter, looking into her eyes. "Julia, honey, you understand that Paul should be with his dad. That's his family." "I understand," Julia nodded. "But he's my friend, and I didn't have time to give Buddy back to him properly. You said real friends don't abandon each other." Tears stood in her eyes. Elena hugged her daughter, feeling heaviness growing in her chest. How to explain to a child that life isn't always arranged the way we want? That people meet and part, that connections break, that promises are broken. Then she felt someone's gaze. Looking up, Elena met eyes with Dennis Anderson. He stood holding his son by the shoulders, looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. "You're Elena?" he asked. "Yes." She stood up, still holding Julia's hand. "And this is my daughter, Julia." Dennis stepped forward and suddenly, unexpectedly for everyone, bowed his head in a short bow. "Thank you," he said simply, "for my son for not passing by. I'm in your debt." And something in his voice, in his gaze, in how firmly he held his son's hand, made Elena think that maybe this meeting wasn't the end of the story, but only its beginning. "My parents died when I was 10. I was put in foster care. Back in the 90s, it wasn't the best place." He paused. "Then a foster family. Briefly. Didn't work out. Then back to the group home until 18. Dear friends, before we continue, right where you're listening to us from, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. We continue." Rose's yard had become a place where different worlds converged. The black SUV with Chicago plates looked foreign next to the old apple orchard and the leaning fence painted with peeling blue paint. Two people who had accidentally collided on life's winding road stood facing each other, connected by an invisible thread through a small boy. Paul wouldn't let go of his father's hand, but kept looking back at Elena, as if afraid she would disappear. In his eyes was joy at reuniting with his father, and simultaneously anxiety about the inevitable parting with new friends. "Maybe we should go inside," Rose suggested, breaking the awkward silence. "Have some tea. It'll be a long conversation, I can feel it." Dennis, still holding his son by the shoulders as if not believing he had found him, nodded. "Thank you. I'd be happy to." In the house, Rose bustled around the samovar, while the children settled next to each other on the old sofa. Paul in the middle, Julia to the right, pressed against the armrest as if wanting to leave as much space as possible between herself and the guests. Elena watched Dennis secretly. Now that the first emotional meeting was over, she noticed how tired he looked. Dark circles under his eyes, a furrow between his brows, nervous tapping of fingers on his knee. Everything betrayed a person who had experienced severe stress. Paul said the nanny was supposed to take him to some aunt. Elena began when everyone had received a cup of tea. "Do you know who that might be?" Dennis shook his head, not taking his eyes off his son. "No, I didn't ask anyone to take Paul anywhere. Victoria was supposed to stay with him at home while I was at work." He ran his hand over his face. "I came home in the evening and there was no one there. Called her, no answer. Then a message came saying Paul had disappeared from the apartment when she was distracted. I went straight to the police." He paused. "God, if it weren't for you." He broke off the sentence, and Elena noticed how quickly he blinked moisture from his lashes. "You didn't check with other relatives? Maybe someone was expecting Paul?" she asked. "I don't have relatives," Dennis answered dryly. "Just my son and me." Something in his tone made Elena feel that behind this phrase hid a whole story. Painful, complex, not meant for strangers' ears. "I gave all the security camera recordings to the police," he continued. "It shows Victoria leading Paul out of the house and putting him in a taxi. It was planned." "But why?" Elena wondered. What's the point of taking a child on a train and abandoning him? Dennis looked at her with a long, studying gaze. She felt as if she were being X-rayed. That's a good question, he said finally. I'd like to know the answer too. But first I'd like to understand something else. Why did you, a stranger, take someone else's child with you instead of calling the police? The question rang out like a shot, direct, sharp. Grandma Rose, who had been clattering dishes, froze. Julia straightened on the sofa. Because he asked for help, Elena answered simply. He said, "Don't leave me. Could you have walked away?" Dennis was silent and she continued. I understand your suspicions. In your place I would doubt too. But sometimes decisions are made with the heart, not the head. Mom couldn't leave him, Julia suddenly interjected, straightening even more. He was alone and scared, and it was getting dark. Dennis turned his gaze to the girl. Something in his face softened. I'm grateful to your mother, he said. I just want to understand the whole situation. There's nothing to understand here, Rose spoke up, setting a plate of pies on the table. One person helped another, that's all. Looking for motives comes from distrust. But I understand these are the times. Everyone suspects everyone. Paul, who had been silent all this time, suddenly gripped his father's hand tighter. Dad, Elena is good, he said quietly. And Julia and Grandma Rose. They fed me and put me to bed. Julia gave me Buddy because I left my bear on the train. He pulled the worn rabbit from his pocket and showed it to his father. But I'll give Buddy back, he added, turning to Julia. I promised to take care of him. Julia nodded but sadly. Elena saw how her daughter struggled with emotions. On one hand, it hurt to part with her new friend. On the other, she was sincerely glad that Paul had found his father. Of course you'll give him back, Dennis said, ruffling his son's hair. And at home I'll buy you a new bear. Or better yet, we'll find your old one. I'll file a report with the lost and found. I don't want a new one, Paul shook his head. I want mine. Something in this simple childish phrase made all the adults exchange glances. Elena understood that for the boy, the bear wasn't just a toy, but a symbol of stability in a world where adults kept betraying his trust. Dad, Paul suddenly looked at his father seriously. Will Elena come with us? This question caught everyone off guard. Dennis blinked. What, Elena? She'll be my new nanny now. Instead of Victoria. Elena felt blood rush to her cheeks. What kind of fantasy was this? Paul, honey, she began gently. I can't go with you. I have Julia, and we live here with Grandma. But we can take everyone, the boy insisted. Julia and Grandma too. It doesn't work like that, sunshine, Elena smiled. Everyone has their own life, their own home. I don't want to leave without you. Paul's lips trembled. Victoria was good at first too, then she left me. Maybe Dad will too. He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. Dennis paled. Paul! He turned his son to face him. I will never leave you. Never. Do you hear? You're my son. I'll always be with you. Mom said that too, the boy whispered. Then she left and didn't come back. Heavy silence hung in the air. Elena looked at these two, father and son, and saw what a deep wound gaped between them. A wound inflicted not by him, but which they had to bear together. Dennis seemed at a loss for words. He looked helplessly at Elena, and she saw such pain in his eyes that she involuntarily leaned forward. Paul, she said, sometimes adults make mistakes, very serious mistakes. But your dad isn't like that. He was looking for you. He cried when he found you. He loves you more than anything in the world. How do you know? The boy asked, turning to her. I can see it, Elena answered simply. In his eyes. In how he holds your hand. In how worried he was. Paul thought, fingering the plush rabbit's ear. Will you come visit us? He asked finally. At least sometimes. Elena hesitated, not knowing what to answer. She understood that after today their paths would diverge, and they were unlikely to ever meet again. She began. Why not? Dennis suddenly said, and everyone looked at him in surprise. After all, I really am left without a nanny, and you, as I understand, are looking for work. He looked at Elena directly, and in his gaze she read something new. Not just distrust but hope. I don't understand. Elena was confused. It's simple. Dennis leaned forward. I need someone I can trust my son with. Paul is already attached to you and your daughter. I'm offering you a job, to look after him temporarily, while we sort out this situation with Victoria. But I live here, Elena objected, with my daughter and grandmother. You could come for the day, Dennis shrugged. Or. He paused, as if unsure of what he was about to suggest. Or, Rose prompted, intervening in the conversation for the first time. Or you could move in with us temporarily, Dennis finished. With your daughter. I have a big apartment, there's room for everyone. It would be a temporary solution. While. He paused again, and Elena understood that he himself was surprised by his proposal. It had been born spontaneously, from a father's desperation who needed to restore his son's trust. This is too sudden, Elena shook her head. We barely know each other. That's exactly why I'm offering work, not something else, Dennis quickly clarified. Purely business relations. I'll pay you for nanny services temporarily, until I find a permanent solution. Elena looked at Julia. The girl listened to the conversation with wide eyes, and such hope read in them that Elena involuntarily smiled. Her daughter didn't want to part with Paul. It was obvious. I need to think about it, Elena said. This is a serious decision. Of course, Dennis nodded. I understand. But Paul had already jumped off the sofa and started hopping in place. Elena will be my nanny. And Julia will come. We'll play together and go to school. Not so fast, young man, Dennis said sternly, but a smile flickered in his voice. Elena hasn't agreed yet. But she will, Paul declared confidently. Right. He looked at her with such faith that refusing was almost impossible. But Elena understood that decisions couldn't be made on emotions. Behind her came quiet laughter from Rose. Well, granddaughter, Grandma said, approaching her and placing a hand on her shoulder. And you were afraid you wouldn't find work. It found you itself. Grandma, Elena whispered. We don't know anything about this person. We know the most important thing, Rose objected. He loves his son. Everything else will follow. Dennis watched their whispering with wary interest. When Elena turned to him, he straightened. I understand your doubts, he said. In your place, I wouldn't trust a stranger either. I can provide references, certificates, whatever you need. No need for certificates, Elena shook her head. But I need time to think and talk with my daughter. Of course, Dennis nodded. I can leave you my contacts. Think it over, discuss it with your family, and let me know your decision. He pulled out a business card holder and handed Elena a card. Here are all my phone numbers. Call any time. Elena took the business card, absently looking at the gold lettering. Dennis Anderson. Home Hearth Restaurant Chain. The situation seemed unreal, as if she had fallen into some movie. Just yesterday she was sitting in an empty rental apartment, not knowing how to live on. And today she was being offered a job in Chicago and housing. Too good to be true. Or had fate finally decided to smile on her after all the trials? Thank you for the offer, she said, looking up at Dennis. I'll think about it. Dad, we're not leaving today, are we? Paul asked, tugging at his father's sleeve. It's already late. Dennis looked at his watch and sighed. You're right, son. It's almost evening. We'll have to stay overnight somewhere nearby. Is there a hotel here? What hotel? Rose threw up her hands. In our backwater. Stay here. There's room for everyone. No, Dennis protested. We've already abused your hospitality. You haven't abused anything, the grandmother cut him off. It's night outside, where will you go? Elena and Julia will spend the night in my room, and you and your son in the guest room. And no objections. Dennis looked embarrassed but grateful. He looked at Elena again with that long, studying gaze. Thank you, he said finally. For everything. I'm in your debt. You don't owe me anything, Elena shook her head. I did what any normal person would do. That's just it, Dennis answered quietly. There aren't as many normal people as we'd like to think. In his eyes flickered a shadow, an echo of some old pain, an old story that Elena could only guess at. But at that moment she understood that Dennis Anderson wasn't just a successful businessman with an expensive car. He was a person with a complex fate, with baggage of mistakes and disappointments like herself. And somehow this thought made her feel a little closer to him. Two people who had collided at life's crossroads, united by care for children and the search for a second chance in a life that was so often unfair. Dennis Anderson's Chicago apartment occupied the entire top floor of an old building in a quiet street, not far from Lincoln Park. The windows overlooked the rooftops of old Chicago, and in the evenings you could watch thousands of lights gradually light up in the twilight, like stars on a darkening sky. Elena stood by the window, hugging herself. A week had passed since she and Julia had moved here. A week filled with awkward pauses, wary glances, and careful steps through the minefield of someone else's life. Temporarily, she reminded herself. All this is temporary. Just work. Dennis pays her to watch Paul while he's busy with business. Nothing personal. Two families who, by chance, found themselves under one roof. Behind her she heard footsteps. Elena turned around. Dennis stood in the doorway of the living room, holding a folder of documents. In home clothes, jeans and a sweater. He looked younger and less tense than in the business suits he usually wore to work. Elena, he nodded. The children are already asleep. Yes, just put them to bed, she smiled. Paul asked for a story. Julia joined in. They fell asleep in the middle of the silver hoof. Something flickered in Dennis's face. I don't remember when I last read him bedtime stories, he said quietly. Always work, business. He broke off the sentence and walked to the table, setting down the folder. How was your day? Good, Elena answered. I did a general cleaning in the children's room, washed winter clothes, helped the kids with homework. Paul tried very hard with math. She spoke evenly, calmly, maintaining distance. That was the agreement. She was a nanny and housekeeper. He was the employer. Everything clear and simple, without unnecessary complications. Thank you, Dennis nodded. I noticed the apartment has become cozier. Elena bit her lip. It was true. She couldn't help herself and gradually brought life into the sterile, faceless space of his apartment. Fresh flowers in vases, soft pillows on sofas, the homey smell of baking. Sorry if I'm overstepping boundaries, she said. No, Dennis hastily objected. Everything's fine. Just unusual. He paused, as if wanting to add something, but changed his mind. She had already learned to recognize these moments when he balanced on the edge between the official tone of an employer and something more personal, human. I made dinner, Elena said, breaking the awkward pause. If you're hungry. Something special. Dennis raised an eyebrow. For the last 3 days, every evening I met by new culinary masterpieces. There was light irony in his voice, but not malicious, rather playful. This was a good sign. Gradually, the icy wall between them was beginning to thaw. Today it's my signature apple strudel with cinnamon, Elena smiled. My grandmother's recipe. She says this dish reconciles people and warms hearts. Sounds almost magical, Dennis smiled slightly. For the first time since they'd known each other, genuinely, without politeness. When they sat at the kitchen table, tasting the strudel, Elena secretly watched him. It seemed to her that with each bite something changed in his face. It became softer, features smoothed out, and something like surprise appeared in his eyes. This is amazing, he said finally. I don't remember when I last ate something homemade, something real. Thank you. Elena felt her cheeks flush from the unexpected sincerity of his tone. I could teach Paul to bake the same. He'd like the process of rolling out the dough. Paul in the kitchen. Dennis was genuinely surprised. He never showed interest. Maybe he was just never offered. Elena carefully noted. Children love creating something with their own hands. It gives them a sense of control over a small piece of the world. Dennis looked at her thoughtfully, as if seeing her for the first time. You understand children very well. I have my own daughter growing up, Elena shrugged. And I used to teach elementary grades. Yes. He paused. Before the divorce. Before the divorce, Dennis finished gently. Elena nodded. They hadn't discussed her past, only the bare minimum necessary for work. But now, at the kitchen table, with the scent of apple strudel hanging in the air, the walls between them seemed thinner. Was it difficult? Dennis asked. Different ways. Elena looked into her teacup, not raising her eyes. The hardest part was when Robert refused his daughter. Right in court. Said he didn't want to see her even on weekends, that he had a new family. And Julia would be inappropriate. The last word came with difficulty. Even now, months later, it burned her tongue like acid. What kind of bastard do you have to be to say that about your own child? Dennis said through gritted teeth. And there was so much cold fury in his voice that Elena involuntarily looked up. He sat clenching his fists so hard his knuckles turned white. His eyes darkened with anger. Sorry, he said, noticing her gaze. I just don't understand such people. How can you refuse your own child? I would for Paul. He didn't finish the sentence but didn't need to. Elena saw it in his eyes. For his son he was ready for anything. To kill, to die, to turn the world upside down. Julia is a very strong girl, she said quietly. She's coping, but sometimes I see how she looks at you and Paul. And there's so much longing in her eyes. She sees what a real father can be like and understands what she was deprived of. Silence hung between them, not awkward but filled with understanding. Two parents, each with their own pain, their own story, but united by the main thing. Boundless love for their children. I could talk to her, Dennis suggested unexpectedly. If you want. Not as a replacement for a father. Just as an adult who understands what it's like to feel abandoned. Something in his tone made Elena look at him more carefully. You went through this too, she asked quietly. Dennis slowly nodded. My parents died when I was 10. I was put in foster care. Back in the 90s, it wasn't the best place. He paused. Then a foster family. Briefly. Didn't work out. Then back to the group home until 18. He said this calmly, as if reading instructions for an appliance. But Elena saw what this calm cost him. How many years it took to learn to talk about this without breaking down, without falling into pain. And then you did everything yourself? She asked. Yes. University, first job, first small restaurant. He smiled weakly. Then I met Paul's mother. I thought I'd finally have a real family. And she left when he was 3. Said she wasn't made for motherhood, that she felt suffocated and cramped in family frameworks. Dennis shrugged with feigned indifference. I didn't hold her back. Better to leave honestly than torture a child with your absent presence. Elena was silent, not knowing what to say. Now much became clear. His distrust, his wariness, his maniacal desire to protect his son. Sorry, Dennis said suddenly. I shouldn't have told you all this. No, Elena shook her head. I'm glad you told me. Now I understand better. That I'm a complete paranoid, he smiled crookedly. That you're a loving father who's afraid of repeating the past, she gently corrected. That's normal, Dennis. We all carry our scars. He looked at her with a long gaze, and something changed in the air between them. As if boundaries had shifted, walls had fallen. You know, he said quietly, I checked up on you. Through acquaintances, looked for hidden motives, a catch. I figured. Elena didn't look surprised or offended. In your place, I would have done the same. And found nothing, Dennis continued. Except that you worked at a prestigious school, were in good standing, then divorce, mortgage, financial troubles. He paused. Sorry for invading your privacy. It's nothing, Elena smiled. So now you know I'm not hunting for rich single fathers. Now I know you're a much better person than I could have hoped for, Dennis answered seriously. Days folded into weeks. Elena got used to the new rhythm of life, the new home, new responsibilities. The children went to the same school. Julia was transferred to the same class as Paul, though she was 3 years older. But after homeschooling with Grandma, she needed time to catch up with her peers, and Dennis used his connections to arrange everything for the best. The first days were difficult. The children would grow closer, then distant, testing the boundaries of new relationships. One day Elena heard loud crying from the children's room. Running in, she saw Paul sobbing over a torn book, and Julia standing in the corner with a guilty look. What happened? Elena asked, kneeling before the boy. She tore my book, Paul sobbed. The one Dad gave me. I didn't do it on purpose, Julia cried out. I just wanted to look, and he grabbed it, and it tore. You always touch everything, Paul shouted. My things, my toys. I don't touch anything, Julia stamped her foot. You're just greedy. Greedy pig. And you're. Paul choked with offense, not finding the right word. You're mean like Victoria. These words hit Julia like a slap. Her face contorted, her eyes filled with tears, and she ran out of the room. Julia! Elena wanted to run after her daughter, but Paul continued to cry, and she was torn between the children. At that moment Dennis appeared in the doorway, having returned from work earlier than usual. What's happening? He asked, surveying the scene. The children had a fight, Elena briefly explained. A book tore, and Paul said something hurtful to Julia. Dennis nodded. I'll talk to Julia, he said unexpectedly. You calm Paul. Before Elena could object, he had already left the room. Half an hour later, when Paul had calmed down and fallen asleep after tears, Elena came out into the hallway and heard quiet voices from the living room. Coming closer, she saw Dennis and Julia sitting on the sofa. They were making something together, gluing the torn book, carefully joining the torn pages with strips of tape. See, Dennis was saying, even if something is broken, it can be fixed. You just need time and patience. What if it doesn't work? Julia asked quietly, not looking up. Then we'll buy a new book, Dennis shrugged. But first it's always worth trying to fix what you have. Elena stood holding her breath, afraid to break the moment. Julia rarely let anyone except her comfort her. And here was a strange man she'd known only a few weeks. Paul called me mean like Victoria, Julia whispered, and her voice trembled. I'm not mean. I didn't want to tear the book. Of course you didn't, Dennis nodded. And Paul knows that. Sometimes when we're angry we say hurtful things. Things we don't really think. Like my dad. Julia suddenly asked, looking up at Dennis. Did he say hurtful things because he was angry too? Dennis froze for a moment, clearly not ready for such a turn in the conversation, but then shook his head. No, Julia. There's a difference between words said in the heat of the moment and decisions made consciously. He paused. Your father made a mistake. A huge mistake that says something about him, not about you. You're a wonderful girl, and any father should be proud of such a daughter. Julia looked at him with wide eyes, absorbing every word. Really, she whispered. Absolutely true, Dennis said firmly. And you know what? I think Paul thinks so too. Otherwise he wouldn't play with you every day, wouldn't wait for you from school, and wouldn't tell everyone that he now has an older sister. Julia blushed. He says that. About a sister? Yes, Dennis smiled. Yesterday he told his teacher. This is my Julia. She's almost like a sister, only better. Julia's face lit up with a smile. She returned to gluing the book with new enthusiasm, and Dennis looked up and met Elena's gaze, standing in the doorway. In his eyes she read a question and hope. Did I do the right thing? Didn't I cross boundaries? Elena smiled at him gratefully and sincerely, and saw tension leave his shoulders. A few days later, Elena was picking up the children from school when she noticed a group of boys surrounding Paul on the playground. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but from the boys' tense posture, she understood something was wrong. She was already heading toward them when she saw Julia drop her backpack and resolutely wedge herself between Paul and the boys. "Leave him alone," she shouted clearly. "Or you'll all get it." "Oh, look, a girl," one of the boys, the tallest, said mockingly. "Protecting her little brother." "He's not my brother," Julia snapped. "He's my friend and you're nobody. Just stupid bullies with nothing better to do." She stood in front of Paul, squaring her shoulders. A small, fragile girl against three boys a head taller than her. "Julia, don't," Paul whispered, tugging at her sleeve. "Let's go." "No," Julia said stubbornly. "We won't leave. This is our school as much as theirs." The tall boy stepped forward, clearly ready to move from words to action. But then Elena finally reached them. "What's going on here?" she asked sternly, standing next to the children. The boys exchanged glances and, mumbling something unintelligible, quickly retreated. "They were calling Paul names," Julia explained, still boiling with indignation. "Saying he doesn't have a mom because he's bad. Idiots." Elena knelt in front of Paul, looking into his face. "Are you okay?" He nodded, though it was clear the words had stung. "Don't listen to them," Elena said. "Your mom didn't leave because of you. Adults sometimes make mistakes, and children have nothing to do with it." "I know," Paul said, but doubt was audible in his voice. "Dad says so too." "And he's right," Elena nodded. "Moreover, you have something those boys don't have." "What?" Paul was surprised. "A real friend," Elena looked at Julia, "who wasn't afraid to stand up for you, even when she was scared." Paul turned his gaze to Julia, and his face brightened. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Always welcome," Julia shrugged. But it was clear she was pleased. "Next time they won't even dare approach you." On the way home, the children walked ahead, discussing something animatedly. Elena watched them, feeling her heart fill with warmth. These two, so different, were gradually finding common ground, learning to trust each other, to protect each other. Maybe, she thought, this is what a real family is, not necessarily connected by blood, but joined by something more important: care, love, readiness to stand up for each other. Then she mentally pulled herself back. What silly dreams. They were here temporarily. Dennis was probably already looking for a permanent nanny for Paul, and she needed to think about the future, about work, about housing, about how to provide Julia with everything necessary. But looking at the children walking ahead, at their heads bent toward each other, dark and light, at their hands intertwined in a trusting gesture, she couldn't shake the thought that something important and right was happening in their lives. Something that perhaps shouldn't be hurried to destroy. When they were climbing to the apartment, Paul suddenly stopped on the landing and looked seriously at Elena. "Elena," he said, "you won't leave us, will you? You're not like Victoria or my mom." The question caught her off guard. She didn't know what to answer. Promised to stay forever. But that wasn't in her power. Tell the truth. But how to explain to a 6-year-old child the complexities of the adult world? "Paul," she began carefully. "Elena won't go anywhere." Dennis's voice suddenly rang out, coming out to meet them on the stairs. "At least in the foreseeable future." He looked at Elena directly, without a trace of his usual wariness. "Really?" Paul brightened. "Really," Dennis nodded. "I just wanted to discuss this with Elena. She's doing an excellent job, and it seems to me we're all good together. So if she agrees..." He left the sentence unfinished, looking questioningly at Elena. "I agree," she said quietly, feeling a shiver run down her spine. "We're good with you too." Dennis smiled. Openly, warmly, without looking back at the past, without fear of the future. Just the smile of a person who, perhaps for the first time in a long while, allowed himself to believe that good things sometimes happen just like that not always behind a smile hides a catch, behind kindness, self-interest behind love, betrayal. And Elena suddenly understood that this smile was the best reward for all the weeks of uncertainty, for all the hours of doubt, for all the minutes when she asked herself whether she had done the right thing agreeing to this strange proposal. The children rushed past them into the apartment with joyful exclamations, and they remained standing on the landing, looking at each other, as if truly seeing each other for the first time. Two people with broken fates who had accidentally met at life's crossroads. Two lonelinesses that had found reflections of their own hopes and fears in each other. And even though there was nothing between them yet except mutual respect and growing trust, Elena suddenly understood that this was already a lot. This was already a foundation, a basis on which something could be built. Maybe friendship, maybe partnership, and maybe, in time, something more. But for now they just stood on the stairs, listening to the joyful voices of children coming from the apartment, and silently accepting the fact that life sometimes presents unexpected gifts, and that sometimes the most important meetings happen on deserted platforms under gray November skies when, it would seem, nothing foretells a miracle. Chicago breathed spring. After the long, exhausting winter, the air filled with the aromas of awakening life. In the parks, the first timid leaves were sprouting, and people finally straightened their shoulders, shedding the weight of winter coats along with accumulated fatigue. For Elena, this spring became a time of strange, fragile happiness. Almost 6 months had passed since a chance meeting on a platform changed their lives. Paul no longer called her Miss Elena, just Elena with a special trusting intonation. Julia had blossomed, caught up with her peers in studies, and now proudly bore the title of Paul Anderson's best friend, which it turned out was an honorable title in their school. And Dennis. With Dennis everything was more complex and simple at the same time. They had long since moved from the formal relationship of employer and nanny to something warmer, more real. Friendship, tender attachment. She didn't dare name what had arisen between them during these months of living together. "What are you thinking about?" Dennis's voice pulled her from her thoughts. They were sitting in his office at the main home hearth restaurant. Outside the window, lilacs were blooming, filling the air with sweet fragrance. In recent weeks, she had been helping Dennis with administrative work, proving unexpectedly talented in management. "About how our lives have changed," Elena answered honestly, sorting through papers on the desk. 6 months ago I was standing on a platform with 2 suitcases, not knowing what lay ahead. And now. Dennis looked at her with that special expression that appeared in his eyes more and more often. A mixture of tenderness, gratitude, and something else she was afraid to identify. "Now we have stability," she said carefully. "The children are happy. You're satisfied with the work. I feel useful." Dennis leaned back in his chair, not taking his eyes off her. "You know, I was thinking," he began, but the office door burst open, and the restaurant administrator appeared on the threshold. "Mr. Anderson." She hesitated, looking at Elena. "There's a visitor for you, very insistent. I didn't schedule any meetings for today. He says it's a personal matter." Identified himself as Robert Williams. Elena froze, feeling the ground disappear from under her feet. "Robert, here. Let him in," Dennis suddenly said, and Elena looked at him in surprise. "Why?" she whispered when the administrator left. "Because sooner or later this had to happen," Dennis answered calmly. "Better to meet the problem face to face than hide from it." Elena wanted to object, but the door opened again, and Robert appeared on the threshold. In the past months, he had hardly changed. Still the same well-groomed, self-satisfied man with a perfect hairstyle and expensive suit. But his gaze was different. Appraising, calculating. "Elena," he drawled with feigned tenderness. "So this is where you've been hiding all these months. I've been looking for you." "Why?" she asked quietly, feeling a wave of nausea rise inside from his false tone. "You said everything in court, that we're not needed." "I was hasty," Robert stepped forward, not paying attention to Dennis. "You know my character. Hot-tempered, said too much. And then you disappeared with Julia, and I couldn't find you." "You weren't looking," Elena shook her head. "You didn't even call because you were satisfied." I was angry, Robert raised his voice, then cooled down and realized I was hasty. He suddenly turned his gaze to Dennis. And you, I take it, are Dennis Anderson. That's right. Dennis calmly introduced himself, not getting up. A family friend. Something in his tone made Robert narrow his eyes. Friend, he drawled with doubt. Or something more. Did you find me a replacement so quickly, Elena? From that Elena, she shuddered. Once, long ago, she had melted with tenderness when he called her that. Now it sounded like an insult. Why did you come, Robert? She asked wearily. What do you want? To get my family back, of course. He spread his hands as if it were obvious. Julia, you, to start everything over. Why now? Dennis interjected, and Elena heard steel in his voice. Why not 6 months ago? Robert shot him an irritated glance. And what business is it of yours? This is between me and my wife. Ex-wife, Dennis corrected gently. I'm here because I care what happens to Elena and Julia. They've become part of my family. He pronounced the last word with special intonation, and Elena felt warmth spreading inside. Not part of his house or his circle, but family. So that's how it is, Robert hissed, and his face twisted. So you just found a fatter wallet, huh? I always knew you were quiet enough, but... Enough, Dennis said quietly but firmly, standing up. One more word in that tone and you'll leave this establishment. Possibly with security's help. Robert fell silent, assessing the situation, then smirked. As you wish. But I came to talk to my daughter. That's my right. Legally, no, Dennis objected. You refused parental rights in court. There are documents. I can contest them, Robert parried. And believe me, if I want to, the court will be on my side. I have connections. Elena felt a lump rising in her throat. Why was he doing this? What did he really want? Julia's at school, she said. But even if she were here, Robert, you refused her. Said she would be inappropriate in your new family. How will you explain that to her? Children need fathers, Robert shrugged. My new wife. We didn't work out, we separated. I realized I was hasty and decided to come back when I learned that I'm no longer struggling. When you saw that I work at a successful company, live in a good apartment, that Julia has everything she needs, that I'm happy, Elena finished quietly. Robert was silent, and in that silence was an answer more eloquent than any words. I'll call Julia tonight, Elena said, feeling strange calm. If she wants to meet with you, fine. I won't interfere. But she'll decide for herself. Robert wanted to object, but the office door opened again, and a tall, slender woman with aggressively bright makeup and cold eyes appeared on the threshold. Victoria! Dennis exhaled, and Elena understood that before them was the very nanny who had abandoned Paul on the platform. Hello, Dennis, the woman smiled, and there wasn't a drop of warmth in her smile. Long time no see. What are you doing here? Dennis immediately tensed, and Elena saw for the first time how his face turned into a stone mask. Came to talk, Victoria shrugged. About money, about the past. About the future. She shifted her gaze to Robert, and between them seemed to run a spark of recognition. Oh, Victoria drawled. And you must be that ex-husband. Didn't expect to meet you here. But it's even more interesting this way. Elena shifted her gaze from one to the other, trying to understand what was happening. Are they acquainted? Are you in this together? Dennis asked directly, nodding toward Robert. Victoria laughed. No, of course not. Just the world is small, right? Especially when it comes to money. What do you want? Dennis asked wearily. Compensation, Victoria answered simply. For moral damage, for you making me out to be a villain who abandoned a child. Though we both know I was just following orders. Whose orders? Elena interjected, feeling anger boiling inside. Who could order abandoning a 6-year-old child at an empty station? Oh, sweetie, Victoria looked at her with contempt. Not everything is so simple in this world. Sometimes you have to make compromises. And Dennis knows this perfectly well, don't you, dear? She turned to him, and something in her gaze made Elena go cold. Something intimate, knowing, as if there had been more between them than just employer and nanny relations. You're lying, Dennis cut off. I never gave you orders to abandon my son. Of course not, Victoria agreed. But there were other people. People you crossed. People you owed. Dennis paled, and Elena suddenly understood that behind all this hid some dark story from his past. A story he had never told. So that's it, Robert suddenly spoke up. I thought he nodded at Elena, had found a rich sponsor. But you, turns out, have your own skeletons in the closet. Both of you leave immediately, Dennis said quietly, or I'll call the police. And what will you tell them? Victoria smirked. That a former nanny came to demand compensation. Or will you tell them the whole story about debts, about threats, about how you built your business? Elena looked at Dennis, trying to find denial in his eyes, but saw only pain and shame. I'll tell Elena everything myself, he finally said. But you shouldn't be here. He pressed a button on the desk, and moments later 2 burly security guards entered the office. Escort these people to the exit, Dennis ordered, and make sure they don't appear in our establishments again. Victoria smiled, coldly, calculatingly. Fine, dear. Just don't forget my offer. $1 million. And I'll disappear from your lives forever. Or, she cast a meaningful glance at Elena, I can tell your new lady what you're really like. And believe me, she won't like it. When they were let out, heavy silence hung in the office. Elena looked at Dennis, waiting for explanations, but he was silent, staring at one point. What's happening, Dennis? She finally asked. Who is this woman really, and why does she say such things? He looked up at her, eyes full of such pain that her breath caught. I need to tell you a lot, he said quietly. About my past, about how I started the business, about the people I had to deal with. Did you do something illegal? Elena asked carefully. No, Dennis shook his head. But in the 90s, the line between legal and illegal was very thin. And sometimes you had to make compromises. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Victoria wasn't just a nanny. At first she was my. He stumbled, searching for words. We dated briefly. Then I realized it was a mistake, but by then she already knew too much about my affairs, and it was convenient for me to keep her close as a nanny. Elena listened, feeling something cold and heavy settling inside. Everything she had thought about Dennis, about his past, turned out incomplete, distorted. What did she mean by debts and threats? Elena asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Dennis sighed. When I started the business, I had to take money from not the most pleasant people. There were no other options. Banks didn't give loans to people like me, without history, without collateral, without guarantors. I paid everything back to the penny, but these people think that once you use their services, you remain in their debt forever. He paused, gathering his thoughts. When I refused their new offer, they decided to pressure me through Paul. They used Victoria. She was supposed to take him to one of these people for a conversation, but at the last moment, apparently got scared of the consequences and just abandoned him at the station, knowing that I would search for my son all over the city instead of dealing with their business. Elena tried to comprehend what she had heard. It sounded like the plot of a thriller, not like the story of an ordinary person. And you never told me about this, she said quietly. I was afraid, Dennis answered honestly. Afraid you'd leave, that you'd take Julia and disappear from our lives. That you'd decide I was dangerous for you. Are you dangerous? Elena asked directly. No, Dennis answered firmly. I severed all ties with those people long ago. Paid them off, put the business on new tracks. Now everything is absolutely legal and transparent. He approached her but didn't dare touch her. Elena, I understand this is too much, that you have every right to get up and leave, take Julia and never see us again. But, his voice trembled. I'm asking you to give me a chance to fix everything. To solve this problem once and for all. Elena looked at him, trying to piece together the fragments of a shattered picture. The man she knew, caring father, reliable friend, honest businessman. And that other one with a dark past and questionable connections. I need to think, she finally said, and talk to Julia about her father. Dennis nodded, understanding that now wasn't the time to insist. Of course. I'll wait. When Elena left the office, her hands were shaking. Too many shocks for one day. Too much truth that needed to be processed. In the evening, when the children went to bed, Elena sat in the kitchen, turning a cup of long cold tea in her hands. The conversation with Julia about her father had been unexpected. I don't want to see him, the girl said firmly when Elena told her about Robert's visit. But he's your dad, Elena noted carefully. Don't you want to give him a chance to fix everything? Julia looked at her mother with a long, unchildishly serious gaze. Mom, she said quietly. He abandoned us when we had nothing, when we were suffering. And now, when everything is good for us, he suddenly remembered us. Elena was silent, struck by the wisdom of a 9-year-old child. You know, Julia continued, Dennis says that a real family is tested in trouble, not in joy. That it's easy to love when everything is good, but staying close when everything is bad, that's real love. Dennis says that. Elena was surprised. Yes, Julia nodded. And he's right. Dad abandoned us when we were suffering. And Dennis, he's always there with Paul and with us, even when it's hard for him. Elena looked at her daughter, trying to process what she'd heard. When had Julia grown up so much? And when had Dennis become such an authority for her? And besides, Julia added with a slight smile, I already have a new family. Paul is like a brother, Dennis is like a good dad. And you're happy with them, I can see it. Elena didn't know what to answer. Yes, she was happy. Despite all the complications, despite all the unspoken things, she felt at home in this strange, accidentally formed family. And now this home was threatened. From two sides at once. Robert with his suddenly awakened paternal feelings, and Victoria with her blackmail. What are you thinking about? Dennis came into the kitchen so quietly she startled. About us probably needing to leave, Elena said quietly. Go back to Grandma until everything settles down. Run away. Dennis sat across from her, looking directly into her eyes. That's not a solution, Elena. Then what is? She felt a wave of despair rising inside. Robert threatens with court. Victoria with blackmail. Julia and I are only complicating your life. You're not complicating it, Dennis said quietly but firmly. You make it complete. Real. He paused as if gathering courage. I love you, Elena. And Julia too. You've become our family. And I'll fight for you even if I have to go through 10 courts and pay 100 blackmailers. Elena froze, struck by his words. He had never spoken of love, never crossed that invisible line they had tacitly drawn between them. You don't know what you're getting into, she whispered. Robert can be very persistent when he wants something. And I can be very determined when I'm protecting my family, Dennis parried. Besides, he added with a slight smile, I have an ace up my sleeve. What? Elena was surprised. Julia, Dennis answered simply. She's old enough for the court to consider her opinion. And if she doesn't want to see her father, no one can force her. Elena felt warmth spreading inside. Dennis had already thought everything through, was ready to fight for them even without knowing what she would decide. And Victoria, she asked, what will we do about her? I'll pay, Dennis shrugged. It's just money, Elena. It's not worth risking our happiness. He reached across the table and Elena, after a moment's hesitation, placed her palm in his. I'm offering you another solution, Dennis said quietly. Instead of running, stay. Instead of hiding, face the problems head-on. Together. Why? Elena asked, looking into his eyes. Why are you ready for all this for us? Because without you my life was incomplete, Dennis answered simply. Because when you came into our home, it became a real home for the first time, not just a place where Paul and I sleep between workdays. Because he squeezed her palm tighter. I never thought I could trust someone again. But you. I could. Elena looked at him, feeling something inside finally fall into place. As if the last piece of the puzzle had finally found its place, and the picture became whole. And one more thing, Dennis added. I want to offer you to become the official manager of the restaurant chain, with a contract, salary, and all authority. What? Elena couldn't believe her ears. But You're a born manager, Dennis interrupted. In these months you've understood the business better than many of my employees have in years. You have intuition, instinct, and most importantly, care for people. They love and respect you. Elena didn't know what to say. This offer was unexpected but right. She really had found herself in managing the restaurants, in working with staff, in creating the special atmosphere that attracted customers. This isn't pity, she asked directly. Not a way to tie us to you. This is recognition of your merits, Dennis answered firmly, and a way to give you financial independence so you can always say no if you want to, so you stay with me not out of necessity, but by choice. At that moment, muffled voices came from the hallway. Dennis and Elena exchanged glances and without speaking went to check. In the doorway of the children's room, they saw Paul and Julia sitting on the floor in pajamas with serious faces. What are you doing here? Dennis asked. Why aren't you sleeping? We were listening, Paul admitted honestly. We know about Victoria and Julia's dad. Elena sighed heavily. Children, these are adult problems. You shouldn't. But these are our problems too, Julia objected. We're a family, right? Right, Dennis said quietly. Then we should decide everything together, Julia said seriously. May bloomed wildly and irrepressibly, as if trying to make up for lost time during the long winter. Apple trees in the parks were covered with delicate white and pink lace, and the air, saturated with their aroma, reminded Elena of Grandma's garden in Millbrook. 6 months. Was that a lot or a little? Enough to heal the wounds of the past, to learn to trust again, to weave a new fabric of life from scattered threads. Elena stood by the window in the office of the main home hearth restaurant, looking at her reflection in the glass. The new strict suit fit perfectly, emphasizing her figure and giving her confidence. Manager of a restaurant chain. Who would have thought fate would take such a turn? And all because of a little boy who had grabbed her bag on a deserted platform. The office door opened, and Dennis appeared on the threshold in a pressed shirt with a folder of documents. Ready? He asked with a slight smile. The lawyers are waiting. Elena nodded, feeling everything tighten inside with excitement. Today much was being decided, not only her professional future, but also personal, their common future. After those revelations a month ago, much had changed. Victoria no longer bothered them. She took the money, signed a non-disclosure agreement, and disappeared from their lives. But with Robert it turned out more complicated and simultaneously simpler. He really refused. Dennis couldn't believe his ears when Elena told him about the result of the meeting with her ex-husband, which she had finally decided to attend. Just like that. Not just like that, Elena shook her head. He saw Julia, heard what she told him, and I think something broke in him, or conversely, fell into place. That meeting in a neutral cafe had been short but important, the epilogue of their story with Robert. Julia, who had taken a solemn promise to go with her, held herself with unchildish composure and directness. You abandoned us when we were suffering, she said, looking her father straight in the eyes. But Mom didn't. She was always there. And now we have a new family. A real one where no one abandons anyone. Robert was silent, finding no words, then quietly asked, Are you happy, Julia? And when his daughter nodded firmly, something in his face softened, and maybe even repentance flickered in his eyes. Then I won't interfere, he said, standing up. But if ever. If you need anything, Julia, you know how to find me. He left without looking back, and Elena knew that this chapter of their lives was finally closed. The contract is drawn up according to all rules, the elderly lawyer was saying, pushing Elena a folder with documents. 3 years with possibility of extension, authority, salary, bonuses, everything as agreed. Elena looked through the pages, experiencing a strange feeling, as if all this was happening not to her. As if she were watching a movie about someone else's more successful life. Sign here and here. Dennis lightly touched her hand, returning her to reality. Her signature on the document, sweeping, confident, seemed to draw a line under the past and open the door to the future. She was no longer just a nanny or housekeeper, not a woman accidentally picked up on life's roadside. She was a professional, a valuable employee, a partner. When the lawyers left, Dennis poured 2 glasses of champagne. To a new stage, he said, offering her one. To a new stage. Elena echoed, taking a small sip. And one more thing. Dennis suddenly became serious. I've started the procedure for official guardianship of Julia. Elena almost choked on her champagne. What? Only with your consent, of course, he hastily added. And hers. But after Robert finally refused parental rights, Julia is legally vulnerable. This way she'll be officially protected. Elena was silent, trying to comprehend this step. This was serious. Much more serious than a contract or any verbal promises. Are you sure? She asked quietly. This is enormous responsibility. I've never been more sure of anything, Dennis answered simply. Besides, he hesitated, Paul already considers you his mom. He told me yesterday. Elena felt a lump rising in her throat. He said that. Yes, asked if he could call you mom. I answered that he should ask you. Dennis smiled, remembering. And you? Elena looked up at him. Do you want this? For me to become? She stumbled, not daring to say the word wife. I want you to be happy, Dennis answered seriously. In any capacity, in any role. But if you're asking whether I want you to become my wife, he paused. Then yes, more than anything in the world. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it. Inside lay a ring, elegant, with a small diamond sparkling in the rays of May sunlight. I'm not proposing, Dennis said quickly, noticing how Elena paled. Not now, it's still too early. This is a promise, a sign that I'm serious in my intentions, that I'm ready to wait as long as it takes. Elena looked at the ring, feeling something warm and bright bloom inside. Hope, which she had not allowed herself to feel for so long. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Don't say anything. Dennis closed the box and placed it on the table. Just know that it's here, that I'm here, that we're all here and not going anywhere. Grandma Rose came on Saturday, and the house immediately filled with special warmth that only the presence of a wise, experienced person can bring. She brought apple jam, hand-knitted socks for Paul, and some mysterious herbs that, according to her, helped the heart open to happiness. Well, granddaughter, she said, stirring something aromatic in a large pot in the kitchen. Found your second chance. Elena smiled, slicing bread. It seems so, Grandma. But sometimes I'm afraid to believe in it. Fear comes from old wounds, Rose nodded. From body memory. But wounds heal if you care for them properly. She threw a pinch of something spicy into the pot. I saw how he looks at you, Grandma continued. The way my Stephen looked all his life, like at a miracle he was afraid to frighten away. Do you miss him? Elena asked quietly. Every day, Rose answered simply. But you know what helps? The thought that he would want to see me happy, that my sadness won't bring him back, but joy. Joy seems to preserve a piece of his light in the world. She paused, stirring the stew. Don't be afraid to be happy, Elena. This man is good, and children are drawn to him. And children sense falseness better than any adult. From the living room came bright children's laughter. Paul and Julia were playing some board game with Dennis. Elena listened, feeling her heart fill with warmth. Her daughter was laughing easily, carefreely, as she hadn't laughed in a very long time. I'll ask him for a meeting, Rose suddenly said. A meeting? Elena didn't understand. With whom? With Dennis, of course, Grandma shrugged. I want to talk to him heart to heart. Man to man always understands, even if one of them has long been in heaven. Elena didn't ask what Grandma meant. Rose always had her own special view of the world, a little mystical, a little practical, but always wise. When dinner was ready, they gathered around the big table. Dennis at the head, Elena opposite, children on the sides, and Grandma Rose next to Julia. A real family, Elena thought, maybe not bound by stamps and documents, but connected by something much stronger. Shared trials, mutual care, readiness to protect each other. I have a toast, Dennis said, raising a glass of juice. To our paths crossing at just the right moment, to coincidences that turn out not to be coincidences, to the second chance that life gives us. To the second chance, everyone responded, and Elena noticed how Grandma secretly wiped her eyes with the corner of her handkerchief. After dinner, when the children went to watch cartoons and Grandma dozed in the armchair, Elena and Dennis stayed in the kitchen, cleaning dishes. I talked to your grandmother, Dennis suddenly said, handing Elena a washed plate. She's an unusual woman. What did you talk about? Elena asked, drying the plate with a towel. About second chances, Dennis smiled. About how life often gives us the opportunity to start over, but we don't always notice it. About how the meeting on the platform was predestined. Grandma loves mystical explanations, Elena shook her head. But actually, it was an ordinary coincidence. Maybe, Dennis shrugged. And maybe not. In any case, I'm grateful for it. He paused, looking out the window at the evening city. You know, I thought I could never trust anyone again. After everything that happened, after Paul's mother abandoned him, after Victoria's betrayal, I seemed to armor myself and was sure it was safer. For me, for my son. Elena listened without interrupting. These revelations were rare, precious. And then you appeared, Dennis continued. With your directness, with your readiness to protect someone else's child, with your integrity. And I understood that not everything was lost, that there are people who can be trusted. He turned to her, and in his eyes Elena saw that same expression Grandma had talked about, as if he were looking at a miracle, afraid to frighten it away. I love you, Dennis said simply. And I'm scared to say this because I'm afraid you'll get frightened, that you'll run away, that you'll decide everything is too complicated and tangled. Elena came closer and carefully touched his face. I'm scared too, she admitted. Scared to believe that after everything that happened, I deserve happiness, that Julia and I won't be abandoned again, that I can be a good mother to Paul. You already are, Dennis said quietly. Even without documents, without stamps. You're his mom, the one who cares, protects, loves. They were interrupted by a quiet voice from the doorway. Mom! They turned around. Paul stood on the threshold of the kitchen, clutching something small in his hand. Yes, dear, Elena responded, and only after saying these words did she realize the boy had addressed her. Can I ask you something? He came closer, extending his hand. On his palm lay 2 bright plastic rings from the kind found in surprise eggs. Julia and I found them in the toy box and thought. He stumbled, looking embarrassedly at his father. What did you think? Dennis asked gently, kneeling in front of his son. That you could get married, Paul blurted out. Julia says then we'd become a real family, and she'd be my sister. Officially. Elena and Dennis exchanged glances, not knowing what to say. There was so much hope in the boy's eyes, so much childish faith in simple solutions to complex adult problems. Paul, Dennis began carefully. Adults can't just. Dad. Paul suddenly became very serious. I know adults complicate everything. But you love each other. Can see. And Julia sees. And Grandma Rose says you're made for each other. Just both too stubborn to admit it. Elena couldn't help but smile, imagining how Grandma discussed their relationship with the children. It's not that simple, little one, she said, sitting next to Dennis in front of the boy. Marriage is a serious decision. You need to know each other well, be sure. But isn't 6 months enough? Paul was surprised. We live together, eat together, do everything together. And Dad smiles when you're around. He almost never smiled before. Dennis coughed embarrassedly. And Julia almost doesn't cry anymore, Paul continued. And she calls Dad Dad, when she thinks no one hears. Elena felt a lump rising in her throat. Julia calls Dennis Dad. Her proud, independent girl who had sworn never to trust men again after her father's betrayal. Quiet conspirators, came Julia's voice from the door. You promised we'd tell them together. She entered the kitchen holding something wrapped in a napkin. Paul and I decided we're tired of waiting for you to gather courage, she declared, coming closer. So we organized everything ourselves. She unwrapped the napkin, and 2 more rings appeared on the table. The real ones from the velvet box that Dennis had shown Elena during the day. Where from? Dennis began, but Julia interrupted him. From your desk drawer. We didn't steal, just borrowed. Temporarily. She looked so serious, so adult at that moment that Elena couldn't suppress a smile. We think, Julia continued, that family isn't stamps and passports and papers. It's when people love each other and care for each other. And we're already a family. She looked at Paul. But it would be great if this became official. Dennis silently looked at the 4 rings lying on the table. 2 real, gold ones and 2 plastic, bright as children's dreams. Then he suddenly laughed. Easily, freely, as if throwing off an invisible burden from his shoulders. You know what? He said, standing and extending his hand to Elena. Our children are much wiser than us. Elena stood next to him, feeling warmth spread inside. I won't propose now, Dennis said, looking into her eyes. Because when I do, it will be a special moment, just for the 2 of us. He turned to the children. But I promise you that this moment will come soon, and we'll become a real family with all the documents, stamps, and other adult formalities. Paul beamed, and Julia suddenly stepped forward and hugged Dennis tightly. Thank you, Dad, she whispered. And Elena saw how his face trembled with emotion for a moment. Always welcome, daughter, he answered quietly, hugging her back. At that moment, Grandma Rose entered from the living room, sleepily rubbing her eyes. What's all the noise? She asked, looking around at everyone, then noticed the rings on the table and smiled knowingly. Ah, there it is. Well, finally. She approached them and placed her wrinkled palms on Elena's and Dennis's shoulders. I bless you, she said simply. Live long, love strong, take care of each other. And remember, family isn't where there are documents. Family is where in difficult times they offer a shoulder, and in joyful times they open their arms. They stood in the kitchen, 2 adults, 2 children, and an old wise woman, united not by blood, not by documents, but by something much more important and eternal. Love, trust, readiness to be there no matter what. There's still much ahead, Dennis said quietly, hugging Elena's shoulders. Paperwork for Julia, an official proposal, a wedding. It won't be easy or quick, but we'll manage it. Together, Elena nodded, looking at the children pressed against them from both sides. Outside the window, the May day was ending, filling the kitchen with golden light. Somewhere far away, in Millbrook, apple trees were blooming in an old garden. Life continued. Unpredictable, complex, but full of possibilities for those who weren't afraid to start over. Second chance. It had come from where Elena least expected it, from a deserted platform of a suburban station in the form of a little boy with frightened eyes, and turned out not to be a fairy tale with a happy ending, but the beginning of a new path. Difficult, requiring work and patience, but real. As was written on that old photograph Elena had found before leaving Chicago, a second chance always comes from where you least expect it. Dear friends, Elena and Dennis's story touched me to the depths of my soul. I sincerely worried about their every step toward new happiness. How would you have acted in Elena's place? Would you have risked trusting a stranger for a second chance at happiness? Share your thoughts in the comments. If the story touched your heart, like it and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Other captivating stories await you on the screen. Learn from others' mistakes and don't be afraid of your happiness. All the best to you. Thank you for listening to the story until the end. Subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends and loved ones. It motivates us to keep working on new stories every day. Don't miss the next amazing story that's about to appear on your screen. We're very grateful to have you with us. See you soon.